The moment no one saw coming Keanu Reeves walked into the hall in silence. There was no grand entrance, no spotlight chasing him across the floor. He carried himself the way he always did, quiet, almost invisible, like he wanted people to look past him. But the truth was, people never could. The crowd noticed him the moment he stepped in, and their hearts felt something different. It was not the usual excitement of seeing a star. It was the calm weight of seeing a man who lived differently. The event was not about him. It was a charity night, a place filled with businessmen, celebrities, and fans who had saved for months just to sit in those seats. The stage was shining with lights. The music was loud, and yet Keanu found a chair near the corner, almost hidden from the crowd. While others smiled for the cameras, he quietly looked at the people around him. He noticed a mother calming her child. He noticed an old man struggling with his cane. He noticed details that no one else cared to see. People whispered, wondering why he was not up front. One fan sitting near him leaned closer and said softly, "You could have sat on stage, you know." Keanu only smiled, shook his head, and whispered back, "I'd rather sit here. I see more this way." That small answer carried a strange power. It was not the voice of a superstar. It was the voice of a human being who refused to place himself above others. The program went on. Names were called, awards were given, and yet something unusual was happening. People kept turning to look at Keanu in the corner. It was not his fame pulling them in. It was his silence. In a room full of noise, his quiet presence felt louder than the music. It felt like respect was standing there in human form. Then came the moment that no one expected. During the break, organizers announced a fundraising challenge. The hall became a competition ground. Wealthy men raised their hands and shouted their donations, each one trying to outdo the other. 100,000, one man declared. Another jumped up. 200,000! The room clapped, and the cameras rushed to capture them. It felt less like giving and more like a show. In the corner, Keanu leaned forward, pulled out a folded envelope, and walked quietly toward the stage. There was no announcement, no microphone, no spotlight. He handed the envelope to the organizer and whispered something. The organizer froze for a second, his eyes wide, before nodding quickly. Keanu walked back to his seat without a word. No one knew what had just happened. The audience kept clapping for the loud donors. But something in the air shifted. The organizer looked at the envelope again, and then at Keanu, who was already back in his chair, sipping water like nothing had happened. A fan sitting near the aisle caught the whole scene. Her hands trembled as she leaned to the person beside her and whispered, "He gave something big, I can feel it, but he doesn't want anyone to know." The suspense began to spread. People who once cheered for the show of money started whispering about the man who gave without saying a word. And that was the hook. In a room full of power, Keanu's quiet action became the loudest voice. But the story did not end there. What was inside that envelope would soon shake the hall, not because of the amount, but because of the way it carried a message that no spotlight could ever capture. The envelope of silence. The hall grew restless as the break ended. The spotlight moved back to the stage. The host smiled wide, and the music tried to carry the energy again. But under that brightness, something invisible had already started to move. Whispers ran through the rows. People kept glancing at the quiet man sitting in the corner. Keanu was leaning slightly forward, his hands folded, his eyes soft and distant, as if the whole show had nothing to do with him. The organizer, who had taken the envelope, could not keep his hands still. He tried to focus on the script in front of him, but his fingers kept brushing against the sealed paper Keanu had passed. Inside, it was not just a donation. It was something weightier, something that pulled at his chest. He looked at Keanu again. The actor gave him nothing more than a small nod, a signal that said, "Do what you feel is right." The host began reading names again, announcing more donors. Cheers rose in the hall each time someone shouted an amount. But the sound felt hollow now, like applause that bounced off the walls but never reached the heart. The organizer finally opened the envelope, his breath catching as he read the number written in quiet ink. It was far beyond what anyone had given that night. It was more than double the highest amount declared on stage. Yet that was not what shook him most. Attached to the check was a note, handwritten in careful, steady words. It said, "This is not for the cameras. This is not for my name. It is for the mother sitting in the back who will go home to no medicine for her child. It is for the old man who will walk out with no money for food. It is for those who cannot stand up and shout a number. Please give them the voice tonight." The organizer read it again, his eyes stinging. He looked up and saw Keanu still in his corner, watching the hall with that same quiet focus. The actor did not care if anyone knew. He only cared if the money reached the forgotten faces in the crowd. The suspense became unbearable. The organizer hesitated. Should he keep this hidden, as Keanu clearly wanted, or should he let people see what real giving looked like? His heart wrestled between respect for Keanu's silence and the need to awaken everyone in that hall. Meanwhile, near the back row, a woman with tired eyes held her daughter close. She had been invited through a local charity. She had come not to be entertained, but in the fragile hope that someone here might notice her. Her daughter coughed softly against her shoulder. She looked up at the glittering lights, the cheering voices, and for a moment she felt smaller than dust. Then, without knowing why, her eyes drifted to the corner where Keanu sat. She had never spoken to him, never met him, but something about his stillness made her believe that maybe she was not invisible after all. On the other side of the hall, a group of fans argued in whispers. "Why did he give it like that?" one asked. Another replied, "Because he doesn't care about being seen." A third leaned closer and said, "Maybe real respect is not shouting the amount. Maybe it's in doing it when no one claps." Their conversation spread like ripples in water, pulling more eyes back toward the quiet corner. Keanu felt the weight of those stares, but stayed the same. He sipped his water, nodded gently when someone passed by, and kept his posture calm. Inside him, however, was not emptiness. It was a fire of compassion that never needed a microphone. Then the organizer made a decision. He stepped forward, his voice trembling as he called the room to silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight we have witnessed many generous gifts. But I must share something that does not come with noise or spotlight. It comes with silence." He held up the note, his hand shaking. "A man has given more than all the numbers shouted tonight. But he asked for no stage, no recognition. He gave for the people who could not be heard." The hall froze. The cameras turned sharply, scanning the room, searching for the person. Some eyes landed on Keanu, but he did not move. He sat still, like a shadow in the corner, as if the words had nothing to do with him. The organizer read the note aloud. As his voice carried those words across the hall, the energy changed completely. The applause faded into a deep hush. The laughter and chatter were gone. What filled the air now was emotion, raw, unfiltered, and heavy. The mother in the back clutched her daughter tighter, tears rolling down her face. The old man with the cane closed his eyes and nodded slowly, like he had been waiting his whole life for someone to remember him in such a way. Even the wealthy donors lowered their eyes, realizing that their loud numbers had never carried the weight of a quiet act of kindness. The suspense tightened around the hall. People knew who it was, but no one dared to shout his name. Respect held their voices down. And in that silence, Keanu remained what he had always been, humble, gentle, unshaken. But this was only the beginning. Because soon, one unexpected twist would force him to stand, not just give. And that moment would reveal even more about the depth of his heart. When silence turned into action, the hall was no longer the same place it had been at the start of the night. The air felt heavier, filled with a strange energy that no one could fully explain. People kept glancing at each other, searching for words, but nothing seemed enough. The organizer's voice still echoed in their heads. "A man has given more than all the numbers shouted tonight, but he asked for no stage, no recognition." Keanu remained seated in the corner, his face calm, almost unreadable. If he had heard the words, he gave no sign. But deep inside, he could feel the shift. Silence had become his language, and tonight that silence was louder than any speech. Yet life never stops at one moment of kindness. It always pushes to test whether kindness can survive when the pressure grows. And that test arrived sooner than anyone expected. A sudden commotion broke out near the entrance. 2 security guards rushed toward the back row. A man was shouting, his voice breaking with frustration. He was not dressed like the wealthy guests. His shirt was worn, his shoes old, and his face showed the kind of pain that comes from years of being ignored. He held a piece of paper in his hand, waving it desperately. "This is a mistake," he cried. "My daughter's name was on the list. She needed help. Why was she turned away? Why is she not included in the program?" The hall froze again. The noise of the music stopped mid-note. The lights dimmed as confusion spread. The organizers tried to calm him, but the man refused to back down. "I watched you all clap for money that means nothing to you," he shouted. "But my child is at home right now, coughing blood, and no one here even knows her name." Gasps ran through the crowd. The host looked helpless, unsure how to handle the outburst. Some guests frowned, whispering that this was ruining the event. Others shifted uncomfortably, feeling guilt but too afraid to speak. And then, from the corner, Keanu stood. The movement was small, but it carried a power that stopped the room. He walked calmly, without hurry, toward the man. There was no anger in his steps, no judgment in his eyes. When he reached him, he gently placed a hand on the man's shoulder and spoke in a voice so steady that even the cameras dared not interrupt. "Tell me her name," Keanu said. The man blinked, his anger breaking into confusion. "Her name is Marissa," he whispered. "She's 8 years old. She was supposed to be here tonight, but they said the list was full." Keanu nodded slowly. He did not look at the organizers. He did not ask for permission. Instead, he turned to the audience and said, "This is why we are here, isn't it? Not for the lights, not for the applause, but for Marissa." The hall went silent again, but this time the silence was heavy with shame. Even the wealthiest donors lowered their eyes. Keanu then reached into his pocket, pulled out another folded paper, and handed it to the father. "Take this," he said softly. "Make sure Marissa gets what she needs. Tonight is for her, too." The father's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was another check, not small, not symbolic, but enough to cover the child's treatment. Tears filled his eyes, his anger melting into disbelief. Why would you do this for us?" he asked, his voice shaking. Keanu only gave a faint smile and answered, "Because no one should be turned away when they are in pain. Not her, not anyone." The audience could no longer stay seated. Some stood up, clapping not for show but from a place of raw respect. Others wiped their tears quietly. The mother in the back row, holding her daughter, closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks. But while the hall erupted in emotion, Keanu simply guided the father to a seat and returned to his quiet corner. He never looked for the cameras. He never tried to take the stage. For him, the act itself was enough. Yet what none of them knew was that this single decision, to stand up for one father, one child, would ripple far beyond the hall. It would spark a chain of events that even Keanu himself could not have predicted. And soon, that ripple would force him to face a choice between staying invisible or becoming the voice for many more who had no one to speak for them. The ripple of kindness. The night could have ended right there, and people would have walked away already carrying a memory they would never forget. But life often stretches one quiet act into something greater, like a stone dropped into water that sends waves far beyond its center. After Keanu had returned to his corner, the hall felt different. The glamour seemed less important. The competition of donations now looked shallow, and the air was filled with a mix of awe and shame. People whispered about what they had just seen. They tried to make sense of it. Some wealthy donors who earlier had shouted numbers with pride now sat in silence, realizing their voices had been loud but empty. But one man could not stay quiet. He was seated near the front, a businessman known for his power and ego. He stood up suddenly, his voice sharp. "Why are we letting this turn into a spectacle of pity? This is supposed to be a celebration, not a stage for sob stories." Gasps filled the room. The father who had spoken earlier shrank back in his chair. The mother in the back row clutched her daughter tighter, fear flashing across her face. The hall, which had been warming with kindness, now trembled under the cold strike of pride. Keanu looked up slowly. His eyes settled on the man, not with anger, but with a quiet strength. He stood once more, his steps steady as he walked toward the stage this time. When he reached the microphone, he paused, letting the silence fill the hall before he spoke. "You say this is a celebration," Keanu said softly, his voice carrying across the room. But what are we celebrating if not the chance to help those who cannot help themselves? Is a hall full of lights worth more than a child's breath? Is applause worth more than a father's tears? His words were simple, but they cut deep. The audience shifted uncomfortably. The proud businessman tried to speak again, but the weight of the silence pressed against him. For once, he could not find words. Keanu looked at the audience, his expression calm yet filled with something unshakable. "We are all temporary," he continued. "Our money, our fame, our comfort, none of it stays. The only thing that lasts is what we give. And if giving makes you feel small, maybe it is not the giving that is small. Maybe it is the heart that resists it." The room broke. People clapped, not politely but with emotion, their hands trembling as they rose to their feet. Some cried openly, others whispered to one another that they had never heard anything like this. The proud businessman lowered his head, his earlier arrogance drowned by the truth that had just been spoken. In the back row, the old man with the cane wiped his eyes and whispered, "Finally, someone said it." The mother with her coughing daughter whispered to herself, "He sees us! He really sees us!" The ripple spread further. Guests who had been quiet all night began to approach the organizers, asking how they could give more, not for recognition, but for the families sitting silently in the crowd. One by one, hands reached out, not upward for applause, but outward toward the forgotten. And still, when the clapping softened, Keanu stepped back from the stage. He did not linger. He walked quietly to his corner once again, as if the stage was too bright for him, as if his words belonged not to him but to everyone who needed them. But that moment had already planted something larger. The cameras had caught his speech even though he never asked for it. The recording would soon leave the walls of that hall and spread to millions who had never seen him that close, never heard his voice so raw, so steady. And among those millions, there would be people who needed hope, people who felt unseen, people who carried wounds hidden under silence. For them, Keanu's words would become more than a speech. They would become a lifeline. Yet the path of kindness is never smooth. As the video spread, not everyone reacted with love. Some voices in the outside world began to twist his silence into doubt, questioning his motives, questioning why he had given so much without speaking sooner. And once again, Keanu would be tested, not in the safety of a hall filled with respect, but in the open world where voices could be harsher, louder, and far less forgiving. When the world began to question, the video left the hall like a quiet spark carried by the wind. Someone had uploaded it that very night, a shaky recording from a phone in the audience. It was not polished, it was not edited, but it carried truth. Keanu's voice filled living rooms, phones, and offices around the world. People watched him stand with calmness, speaking about giving, speaking about what truly mattered. Millions reacted with awe. Comments poured in, words of respect, stories of how his silence had touched their hearts, and messages from people who felt seen for the first time. Families who had been ignored felt hope. Young people who had grown tired of empty words finally felt they were hearing something real. But as always happens when light shines, shadows moved quickly. A group of critics began to speak loudly. "Why now?" they asked. "Why didn't he say these things years ago?" Others whispered, "Maybe it's all just a show. Maybe he planned this to build his image." The media storm grew louder each day. Headlines flashed. Is Keanu's kindness real or staged? Talk shows debated, splitting into two sides, those who defended him and those who wanted to tear him down. Some called him a saint, others called him a manipulator. Keanu saw it all, yet he stayed quiet. While the world argued, he went on living the way he always had. He rode the subway, quietly giving up his seat for strangers. He paid for meals for homeless people without ever taking credit. He visited hospitals without cameras, holding the hands of children whose names no one knew. But because the storm outside was so loud, many people could not see these quiet acts. Inside him, however, a conflict began to rise. He never wanted fame. He never wanted to be the center of attention. But now, millions were watching his every move, twisting his silence into meanings that were not his. One evening, sitting alone in his apartment, Keanu looked at the city lights outside his window. The world was noisy, restless, and suspicious. He whispered to himself, Is it enough to give quietly when the world demands a show? He thought about the father whose daughter's name had been left off the list, about the mother in the back row, about the old man with the cane. He thought about how kindness to one person could ripple, but also how it could be drowned by voices of doubt. That night, he made a decision. He would not defend himself with interviews or flashy headlines, but he would let his actions speak louder than ever. If people doubted, he would give them something undeniable, not with words, but with proof that could not be twisted. The test came sooner than he expected. A week later, a hospital in the city announced it would shut down one of its wings due to lack of funding. It was the wing that treated children with rare diseases. Parents cried outside, holding their sick children, begging the government to help. News channels showed their tears, but few listened. When Keanu saw the report, his heart tightened. He knew what had to be done. The next morning, without warning, he walked into that hospital. He wore simple clothes, no cameras followed, but word spread quickly. Parents gasped as they saw him walk through the doors, not as a star, but as one of them, holding no spotlight except the kindness he carried inside. He met the hospital director quietly, asking what was needed to keep the wing alive. The director, stunned, explained the costs. It was a number so large that most would walk away. But Keanu only nodded as if the decision was already made in his heart. By evening, the papers were signed. The children's wing was saved. Parents cried openly, hugging each other, some even falling to their knees in gratitude. But Keanu refused to stand in front of the cameras waiting outside. Instead, he walked out through the side door, his face calm, his steps quiet, leaving the miracle behind him. Yet the world found out. Not through him, not through a press release, but through the parents who could not stay silent. They told their stories online. They showed their children smiling in hospital beds that would have been taken away. And this time, even the harshest critics could not deny it. No one could say it was staged. No one could say it was for fame. It was too raw, too real. But while the world celebrated, Keanu sat alone that night, wondering why the world needed proof at all. Why did kindness have to be shouted to be believed? Why could silence not be enough? The questions weighed heavily on him, and he knew that more storms were coming. The louder his kindness grew, the more it would be tested. And soon he would face not just doubt, but something far greater. A challenge that would shake his belief in silence itself. The breaking point days turned into weeks, and the world could not stop speaking about him. Every news channel replayed the video from the charity hall. Every article carried the story of the hospital wing he had saved. His silence had turned into something the world could not ignore. But fame is a double-edged sword. The more people celebrated him, the more others looked for cracks. Critics began to say, he can give because he is rich. Kindness only counts when it costs you everything. Others whispered, how do we know he is not building a hidden image campaign? The pressure grew. His face appeared on magazine covers he never agreed to. Television shows invited endless panels to discuss his motives, his past, his future. And still, Keanu stayed quiet. He walked the streets the same way, rode the subway the same way, carried his own bags the same way, yet the noise around him was deafening. Then came the moment that nearly broke him. A group of children, the very ones who had been saved by the hospital wing, wanted to meet him. They had painted drawings, written letters, and made a small stage at the hospital to thank him. Keanu arrived quietly, expecting only a short moment of gratitude. But when he stepped inside, the room was already filled with cameras. Reporters had surrounded the children, turning their pure joy into another headline. As the children ran to him with open arms, flashes blinded their eyes. Microphones pushed into their small faces, asking them questions they did not understand. Keanu held them, shielding them with his arms, his chest tightening with anger he had kept hidden for years. He whispered to the reporters, "Please, not here. Let them have this moment." But they did not stop. One child, a little boy with tubes attached to his arm, looked up at Keanu and asked softly, "Why are they so loud? I just wanted to give you this." He held up a crumpled drawing of Keanu holding hands with the children. Keanu knelt, took the paper with trembling hands, and hugged the boy. He forced a smile, but inside, something cracked. He realized that no matter how quietly he gave, the world would always try to turn it into noise. That night, sitting in the hospital garden after the visit, Keanu felt the weight of doubt heavier than ever. He asked himself, "Am I doing this the right way? Is silence strong enough when the world demands spectacle?" His heart wrestled with the truth. He remembered the man at the charity hall who had shouted with pride, the critics who demanded proof, the cameras that turned children's gratitude into headlines. He wondered if maybe silence was not enough anymore. But then, as the night grew still, the boy from earlier walked into the garden, holding his mother's hand. He came closer and whispered, "Don't stop! We know you are real. Even if they don't believe you, we do." Those words pierced through the heaviness in his chest. Keanu closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and smiled faintly. The boy's voice reminded him of something he had always believed, but almost forgot. Kindness is not measured by who believes it. It is measured by who feels it. Keanu knew then that his silence was not weakness. It was strength. The louder the world grew, the calmer he would remain. The more they demanded a show, the more he would return to the quiet corner where respect lived. But destiny was not finished with him. One final moment was waiting. A test greater than all the rest. A situation that would force him to show whether humility could truly stand against the harshest storm. And that storm was already on its way. The storm and the light. The storm arrived one morning without warning. A scandalous headline spread across newspapers and social media. Keanu Reeves under fire. Kindness or performance. An article accused him of using charity for influence, twisting his silence into something selfish. The world exploded with noise. Some defended him fiercely, saying his actions spoke for themselves. Others doubted, saying, "If he is truly humble, why do we hear about him so often now?" The debate became louder than ever before. Keanu sat in his small kitchen, the article spread across his table. He read each line slowly, not with anger, but with deep sadness. He had never wanted this. He had never asked for cameras, never wanted his name tied to fame through giving. He whispered to himself, "All I wanted was to help quietly." Is that too hard for the world to understand? That evening, the organizers of the charity called him. "Keanu," they said, "the press wants a statement. People need to hear your side. If you stay silent, they will crush you." Keanu closed his eyes. His heart was heavy. But then he remembered the boy in the hospital garden who had whispered, "We know you are real." He remembered the father in the hall, shouting for his daughter Marissa. He remembered the mother in the back row, clutching her child. He remembered the old man with the cane who had said, "Finally, someone said it." Those were the voices that mattered. Not the cameras, not the critics, not the headlines. So instead of calling a press conference, Keanu did something no one expected. He returned to the same hall where everything had begun. The organizers were confused, the staff worried, but he insisted. "I want to be with the people," he said softly. When the night came, the hall was filled again. Not just with wealthy donors this time, but with families, children, and ordinary people who had heard the story and wanted to see him with their own eyes. The tension was thick. Some had come to defend him. Others had come to judge him. Keanu walked to the front slowly, not toward the stage, but to the floor where the people sat. He did not carry notes. He did not bring cameras. He simply stood there, his hands folded, his voice calm. "You have heard many things about me," he began. "Some of them true, some of them not. But tonight I will not defend myself. I will not argue, because kindness does not need defense." The hall was silent. Every ear strained to hear him. "If you think my giving is for fame," he continued, "then do not look at me. Look at the mother who can buy medicine for her child. Look at the father who no longer fears losing his daughter. Look at the children whose hospital wing is still alive. If you see them smile, then you already have the answer." His voice grew softer, almost breaking. "I am not perfect. I am not a saint. I am just a man who has seen enough pain to know that silence can be louder than applause. So if my quiet bothers you, forgive me. But I will not stop, because somewhere out there, another Marissa waits. Another child coughs. Another old man walks with no food. And if my silence can reach them, then that is enough." For a moment, no one moved. The silence was so deep, It felt like the whole world had paused. And then from the back row, a voice broke through. It was the little boy from the hospital garden. He stood on a chair, holding up his drawing of Keanu with the children, and shouted, "We believe you!" The hall erupted. People stood, clapping, crying, not out of politeness, but out of something raw and real. Families hugged. Strangers wiped tears from each other's faces. The proud businessman from the first night even bowed his head, humbled by the truth he could no longer deny. Keanu did not raise his arms. He did not bow. He simply smiled gently at the boy, nodded to the crowd, and stepped back to his corner, the place he had always belonged. That night, the world finally understood. Keanu's power was not in speeches, not in headlines, not in cameras. It was in the quiet way he carried himself, the way he gave without asking for anything, the way he stood in silence while others shouted, and for millions who watched the story unfold. One message became clear. You do not need to be loud to be strong. You do not need to be seen to make a difference. Sometimes the quietest giving becomes the loudest echo in the hearts of people.